In 1998, millions of pages of secret tobacco industry documents were forced into the open. Inside those files was a story darker than most people imagined. For decades, some of the most powerful cigarette companies in the world had studied what smoking did to the human body, while telling the public that the science was still uncertain. They sold doubt. They sold glamour. They sold freedom. And behind it all, they sold a product they knew could kill. But the story of tobacco did not begin in a courtroom. It began as sacred smoke, a plant burned in ceremony, carried in prayer, and treated by many indigenous cultures as something powerful, dangerous, and spiritual. Then, empire found it. This is the history of tobacco. Long before Europeans ever saw a tobacco leaf, indigenous peoples across the Americas had cultivated and used tobacco for thousands of years. But it was not used the way modern tobacco is used. It was not a casual habit. It was not a cigarette break. It was not a product designed for mass consumption. Across different cultures, tobacco could be part of ceremony, medicine, diplomacy, prayer, and spiritual practice. Smoke carried meaning. It could mark a treaty, accompany a ritual, or connect the physical world to the invisible one. The plant was powerful, and because it was powerful, it was treated with respect. That distinction matters, because one of the oldest patterns in commodity history is this: empire often takes something meaningful from one culture, strips away its context, and turns it into a product. When Europeans first encountered tobacco in the Americas, they did not fully understand what they were seeing. Some were fascinated. Some were disgusted. Some believed it had medicinal powers. In 1500s, tobacco spread through European courts, ports, and medical circles as a strange new world plant. It was smoked, sniffed as snuff, chewed, and sometimes praised as a treatment for conditions people barely understood. The name nicotine comes from Jean Nicot, the French diplomat who helped popularize tobacco in France. At first, tobacco was wrapped in mystery. It was exotic. It was fashionable. It was controversial. Some rulers and religious authorities condemned it. Others tolerated it. Consumers kept using it anyway. That is the thing about tobacco. Once people discovered its effect, bans alone were rarely enough. Across the Atlantic, England was trying to build a permanent foothold in North America. In 1607, the English founded Jamestown in Virginia. It was supposed to become a profitable colonial outpost. Instead, it nearly collapsed. The settlers did not find gold. They struggled to grow enough food. Disease, hunger, conflict, and poor planning brought the colony close to failure. For a colony built on dreams of wealth, Jamestown was a brutal disappointment. The investors wanted profit. The settlers wanted survival. The empire wanted a reason to keep sending ships. Then tobacco changed everything. Not because it was noble, not because it was healthy, but because Europe wanted it badly enough to pay for it. In 1612, a colonist named John Rolfe successfully cultivated a sweeter strain of tobacco, Nicotiana tabacum, connected to the Caribbean tobacco that European consumers preferred. This was the breakthrough Jamestown needed. By 1613, Virginia was committing itself to tobacco as its primary export crop. Within a few years, tobacco shipments to Europe were rising quickly, and Virginia tobacco began to build a reputation in the Atlantic market. Jamestown had not found gold under the ground. It had found something almost as valuable growing from the soil. The plant saved the colony's business model, but it also tied Virginia's future to a crop that demanded land, time, constant attention, and cheap labor. The colony now had a crop that could make money. What it did not have was enough people willing to grow it. To solve its labor problem, Virginia developed a system that turned human bodies into a pathway to land. In 1618, the colony introduced the Headright System. The idea was simple. A colonist could receive land for bringing workers into Virginia. Those workers might be European indentured servants, or they might be Africans brought into the colony under very different conditions. On paper, the system was about settlement. In practice, it rewarded men who could control labor. The more people a planter could bring, the more land he could claim. The more land he claimed, the more tobacco he could plant. The more tobacco he planted, the more labor he needed. A crop had created a loop. Land demanded labor. Labor expanded land. And tobacco sat at the center of it all. For much of the early 1600s, tobacco labor in Virginia depended heavily on indentured servants. Many were poor Europeans who agreed to work for several years in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. Their lives were harsh. The work was brutal. Many died before their terms ended. But in theory, indentured servitude had an endpoint. A servant might eventually become free. For wealthy planters, that was the problem. Tobacco was profitable when labor was cheap. It was even more profitable when labor could be controlled for life. As the century moved forward, conditions in England changed. Fewer poor Europeans were willing to cross the Atlantic as servants, and Virginia's planter class began searching for a labor force that would not disappear after a few years. Then came Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. For a brief and terrifying moment, poor white laborers, servants, and enslaved black people challenged the colonial elite. To Virginia's planter class, the rebellion revealed a dangerous possibility. People at the bottom of the labor system might unite against those who owned the land. Afterward, colonial law increasingly hardened racial lines. Freedom, labor, inheritance, punishment, and status became more deeply tied to race. A mixed and unstable labor system was transformed into something more permanent, more hereditary, and more brutal. Tobacco did not single-handedly invent American slavery. History is never that simple. But tobacco helped shape the Chesapeake system that made race-based slavery central to colonial wealth. The more Europe smoked, the more Virginia planted. And the more Virginia planted, the darker the labor system became. Tobacco is not an easy crop. It requires seedbeds, transplanting, weeding, topping, harvesting, curing, sorting, packing, and constant attention. A field of tobacco was not just land. It was a schedule, a discipline, a machine built out of soil, weather, tools, and bodies. By the 1700s, tobacco had become the economic foundation of Virginia and Maryland. In some places, tobacco functioned almost like currency. It paid debts, it paid taxes. It moved through warehouses, ports, ledgers, and ships. But the wealth did not flow to the people whose hands touched the leaves. It moved upward to planters, merchants, creditors, ship owners, and imperial markets. This is the hidden structure behind many everyday products. The consumer sees the finished object. The empire sees the profit. The laborer feels the cost. A pipe in London might feel like fashion. A pinch of snuff in Paris might feel like sophistication. A planter's ledger in Virginia might look like business, but all of them were connected by the same crop. Tobacco made distance useful. The farther away the labor happened, the easier it became for consumers to ignore. The field disappeared behind the habit. The worker disappeared behind the smoke. The violence disappeared behind the price. This pattern did not end with tobacco. It became one of the operating systems of the modern world. Move the pain far away, polish the product, and sell only the pleasure. While Virginia built an economy around tobacco, the plant was spreading across the world. Within a century of European contact with the Americas, tobacco had moved through Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. It was smoked in pipes, ground into snuff, chewed, rolled, traded, taxed, banned, and consumed anyway. Some rulers attacked it as immoral, unhealthy, foreign, wasteful, or socially dangerous. But like coffee, tea, and sugar, tobacco had already found a place inside daily life. It was social, it was physical, it was addictive, and it was profitable. That combination made it almost impossible to erase. By the 1700s, tobacco had become one of the first truly global consumer commodities. This was tobacco's transformation. A plant that once carried prayers into the sky became a product moving through the bloodstream of empire. It was no longer only a ritual. It was revenue. Governments taxed it, merchants shipped it, Planters grew it, sailors carried it, consumers built habits around it. Tobacco's power came from repetition. One pipe was small. One pinch of snuff was small. One chew was small. But repeat a small desire millions of times across ports, colonies, armies, taverns, factories, and homes. And suddenly, a plant becomes infrastructure. That is how commodities shape history. Not always through one dramatic event, but through ordinary actions repeated at massive scale. Tobacco did not need to conquer the world all at once. It only needed people to come back for more. For centuries, tobacco was consumed in many forms. Pipes, snuff, chewing tobacco, cigars, hand-rolled cigarettes. But the modern tobacco age began when the cigarette became industrial. In 1880, James Bonsack patented a machine that could roll cigarettes automatically. That invention changed everything. A product that had once required hand labor could now be made at enormous speed. Cigarettes became cheaper, more uniform, and easier to sell in massive quantities. The cigarette was small, portable, fast, modern. It fit perfectly into the industrial world. And once machines could make cigarettes by the millions, companies needed to create smokers by the millions. That is where advertising entered the story. Cigarette companies learned to sell more than tobacco. They sold masculinity. They sold glamour. They sold rebellion. They sold sophistication. They sold calm. They sold freedom. During the World Wars, cigarettes became part of military life. They were distributed to soldiers, packed into rations, traded in trenches, carried in pockets, and remembered as small comforts in terrifying places. For many men, the habit followed them home. By the mid-20th century, smoking was everywhere. In offices, in movies, in restaurants, in hospitals, on airplanes, in advertisements, in the hands of heroes, celebrities, soldiers, doctors, and ordinary people. The cigarette had become one of the most successful consumer products in history. And then, the evidence began to catch up.
By the early 1950s,
scientific evidence linking cigarette smoking to serious disease was becoming harder to ignore. Doctors were seeing patterns. Researchers were asking questions. Public anxiety was rising. Inside the tobacco industry, companies studied the problem too. They knew the danger was not just a public relations issue. It was a threat to the entire business. If the public fully understood the risk, the cigarette could lose the image that made it powerful. It could stop being glamorous. It could stop being normal. It could become what it always was, a delivery system for addiction and disease. The industry faced a choice: admit the danger and risk the market, or protect the market by keeping the public unsure. The industry chose a strategy that would become famous far beyond tobacco. It did not need to prove cigarettes were safe. It only needed to keep the public unsure. Doubt became the product behind the product. Tobacco companies funded research, public relations campaigns, and messaging designed to keep the debate alive. As long as people believed the science was unsettled, they might keep smoking. This was not just advertising. It was a battle over reality. One side had disease, addiction, and internal documents. The other side had money, lawyers, lobbyists, scientists for hire, and decades of marketing experience. For years, public statements carried an atmosphere of confidence, while the internal story looked very different. The cigarette sold smoke. The corporation sold uncertainty. Then, litigation forced the doors open. In 1998, the MASTA settlement agreement between major U.S. tobacco companies and state attorneys general helped bring millions of pages of internal industry documents into public view. Those documents exposed how deeply the industry had understood the risks and how aggressively it had worked to shape public doubt. It was one of the largest corporate scandals in modern history. For decades, tobacco companies had sold an image of confidence while hiding a much darker internal record. The lie had lasted long enough to become culture. It had been printed in magazines, projected in movies, carried by soldiers, repeated by advertisers, defended by lawyers, and inhaled by millions. Unlike smoke, The documents did not disappear into the air. The dark history of tobacco is not only a story about the past. It continues in the fields where tobacco is still grown. In parts of the modern tobacco supply chain, labor organizations and government reports have documented child labor, poverty, and dangerous working conditions. Malawi is often discussed as one of the clearest examples. Tobacco has been a major export crop there, yet many small farmers and workers remain under intense economic pressure. When prices are low and buyers demand cheap tobacco, the pressure moves downward to the people with the least power. In some tobacco-growing regions, children have been reported working in fields. This does not mean every farm is the same, but it does mean the old pattern has not disappeared. The product becomes polished, while the labor behind it remains easy to ignore. Some tobacco workers handle wet tobacco leaves without proper protection. That matters because wet tobacco leaves can release nicotine through the skin. The condition is known as green tobacco sickness. Symptoms can include nausea, dizziness, vomiting, headaches, weakness, and changes in heart rate or blood pressure. It is a strange and brutal irony. A product known for delivering nicotine to consumers can also poison the workers who harvest it before it ever becomes a cigarette. The danger is not cinematic. It is not dramatic in the way movies show danger. It is quiet. A wet leaf, a long day, a body absorbing what the market will later package and sell. 400 years after Jamestown, tobacco still asks the same question. Who pays the real cost when a profitable habit must stay cheap? Tobacco began as sacred smoke, a plant used in ceremony, healing, and prayer. Then, empire turned it into a crop. Jamestown used it to survive. Virginia used it to expand. Planters used it to build wealth. Colonial law used it to harden systems of labor and race. Factories used it to create cigarettes by the millions. Advertisers used it to sell identity. Corporations used it to protect profit. And modern supply chains still carry the pressure of keeping tobacco cheap. That is the story hidden inside the leaf. Tobacco is not only a plant, it is a mirror. It shows how quickly meaning can become merchandise, how easily ritual can become habit, and how profit can bend law, labor, science, medicine, and memory around itself. A cigarette may look small, but inside it is a history of sacred practice, colonial expansion, racial slavery, industrial addiction, corporate deception, and modern labor. The next time you see tobacco, do not only see smoke. See the fields, see the ships, see the plantations, see the advertisements, see the documents, see the workers, see the lie that was sold for generations. Because tobacco did not merely pass through history, it changed the way history was bought, sold, hidden, and inhaled. If this story changed the way you see everyday products, subscribe to Dark History Archive, because the things people consume are never just things. They are power. They are memory. They are money. And sometimes they are evidence of what the world tried to forget.